Hi, this lecture is a review for Chapter 2 and the material contained in the prep guide for Chapter 2. And I'm also going to go at the end of this brief narrated lecture, I'm going to go through the wiki that you guys created and point out a few things and talk about a few things. You can expect from now on to have a narrated sort of lecture like this and a review of the wiki for every unit. I wasn't able to do one for Chapter 1 just because of time constraints, but from now on you can expect a narrated sort of lecture on the material from the previous day. Now, this may not make sense, or it may make sense as we go, but what the system that I want to use is I want you guys to go through the prep guide, construct the wiki, and do those things, and then complete the poll. And the poll is really super important. It's not graded. It's just questions. It's feedback to me. But the poll is going to help me make these lectures so I can answer your questions, the things that you're having trouble with. So the poll is really important. And because I don't read the poll until the morning after the unit's due, I can't really construct this lecture until I have the results of that poll. And so that's how it's going to work, is that after a unit, after you guys are done, I'm going to read your responses to the poll questions, and then I'm going to construct a brief lecture, narrate that lecture, and then post it, go through the wiki, and hopefully clarify anything. So what that means is that if you're about to take the probe or want to take the probe, you might want to wait until the review lecture is posted, and then hopefully all the points will be clarified. And then after reviewing, then you can take the probe and then move on to the next unit. So this is going to be a review for Chapter 2. And I think it would be a good idea to go through this first. Obviously you are, and then, but maybe in the future, maybe you made the mistake of taking the probe already, and then you can move on to Chapter 3. Okay, some of you had, many of you expressed problems or concerns or questions about the question about a feedback system. And basically, what I wanted you to get out of this, and I think maybe Mazer goes into a little bit more detail than he should, but basically I want you guys to recognize that there are systems, that in systems control theory, that there's this theory of feedback, and it's applicable to behavioral systems, or at least psychologists have adapted it to behavioral or physiological systems. And basically a feedback system is that some or all of the output alters the input, thereby influencing the action of the system. There's many mechanical systems. You know, your book goes through the example of a thermostat. There's an old feedback system called a governor in old steam engines that's really classic and really sort of cool sort of thing. But psychologists have applied this to behavioral systems as well. And one really good example is a feeding, and it applies at multiple levels. So let me give you an example. Let me try to tell you a little bit about feeding. Right? We all know what feeding is. When our stomach is empty, we feel hungry, or we're hungry, we go and eat, and as our stomach gets full, we stop eating. So in a sense, what we're saying is that as our stomach gets full, that's the output, it slows down the input. So the output of the system alters how much comes in, and it's your basic eating system or feeding system. At a hormonal level, there's another feeding system, and that is, as you have low blood sugar, there are hormonal signals that activate other systems, that you seek out food, you eat it, your blood sugar then level changes, and there are other hormones, and these involve insulin and ghrelin and leptin and so on. And these are physiological feedback systems. And if you notice, they're sort of slow. Sometimes feedback systems can be slow. I don't know if you've ever noticed, you've been really hungry and you eat and 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 eat, and then all of a sudden you feel really full. Like 10 minutes later you feel really full. It's because there's a delay. These chemicals take a little while to do their work and give you the feedback. One of the primary reasons I wanted you to learn a little bit about feedback systems, and we're going to talk about feedback systems, is in the sense that these are closed loop systems, and that's very important. What we're going to see in a lot of behavioral systems is that the output winds up affecting the input, and that becomes really important. They're closed loop in that they loop back on each other. We're gonna see this in a lot of examples. So if you understand the basic phenomena that the output of a system affects its input to the system as a feedback system or as a closed loop system, then you're good. If you have more, if you are struggling with a comparator and those sorts of things, don't worry too much about that. That's a little more sophisticated than you need to know. A lot of you had questions about or problems with the question about the reflex, and that is, can you talk about the reflex without talking about the stimulus that elicits it? And it is true that the physiology of many reflexes have been worked out, and the neurons involved, and this spinal arc, and those sorts of things. So to begin with, we might want to ask why the reflex is so important. And it is important. It's very important, and it's, in fact, when you go to the doctors and have a physical, one of the things he tests your reflexes. And he tests the patellar reflex. Now, the patellar reflex we all have experienced. It's the patellar tendon in your knee, right? And he gets out that little hammer, and he asks you to dangle your leg, or she asks you. I have a woman doctor, I should say. She asked me to dangle my leg, and she knocks it with that little rubber hammer, and then I give a little kick, and that's called the patellar reflex. There's one input and there's one output, meaning that there's one hammer blow and one kick. And what she's testing to make sure that my central nervous system is functioning properly. And it's a great way to test it. It's what we do. It's how to see if there's any central nervous system problems. However, the reflex isn't just the response. Not any old stimulus. She can't yell at me, and I'll and have my patellar reflex occur. She can't give me smelling salts and my and I kick her, or I kick my leg. The patellar reflex is a relationship between a blow to the patellar tendon and a kick. So it's hard to talk about a reflex without talking about its characteristic stimulus. And that is one of the answers to the questions about how do we talk about these things. Now, I disagree with your book a little bit in that a reflex is not a feedback system. I think it's more of what we would call an open loop system, and that is there's one input and one output, and the output doesn't affect the input. Because I kicked doesn't influence whether the doctor is going to strike my patellar tendon again. And she might strike it a couple of times. And in each time what we see is I give a little kick. So whether or not the reflex is a feedback system may be a question of debate. I think at the behavioral level, it is not. But maybe at the physiological level, when we're talking about neurons and connectivity and those sorts of things, maybe it is a feedback system. Habituation, I think you guys all got pretty well, and that is the repeated stimulation reduces the response. Some people have hypothesized or postulated that it was fatigue, that your reflexes were dampened over frequent stimulation because of fatigue, but that you can be startled, or you can have habituation of startle that occurs over long periods of time where fatigue wouldn't be an issue. And the reason we start with habituation sometimes is because it looks like a rudimentary form of learning, is what it is. One of the explanations of habituation that's been proposed is opponent process theory. Opponent process theory is called opponent process because what we have is we have opposite actions or opposite reactions that are working against each other. So for emotional sorts of events, or emotive behavioral events, if you will, if we talk about X event producing joy, if something happens and you're very joyous, the opponent process theory people talk about an A process and a B process. One being the positive joy, happiness, and B being anti-happiness, or the opposite, or the opponent process of A. When X first happens, A produces a lot of joy, but then B comes along and sort of dampens it, because we can't be joyous following an event all the time. It's got to dampen over time. And the explanation for this is that the B process sort of comes along. The net result is you're very high, and it diminishes over time. And then if X happens again, A again produces the same experience, but B comes on a little bit more quickly and dampens it quicker. And the net result is you get a nice high, but you're quickly back to reality. When X happens again, A produces, much joy, but B is right there to dampen it, and the net result is little or no high. And then later you're pretty down. Or maybe you're not down, but maybe you're just even keel. I mean, one thing that we could talk about here is first kiss. I mean, hopefully everybody's experienced a first kiss, and that's pretty awesome. There's nothing. I remember a student that worked with me in research at Temple when I was a graduate student, and her name was Karen, and Karen talked about the first kiss she had with her boyfriend, her new boyfriend, being unlike anything she ever experienced. And I think that's true. I think the phenomena of kissing someone, the stars you see, and the explosion in your brain, so to speak, or that experience is so high, and you never capture that again. You never have that first makeout session again, right? It's always a little bit less interesting and exciting than it was the first time. It's always different the first time, and maybe that's opponent process. I would say here, some of you guys had questions about opponent process on the poll, and some of you raised a really good point. Opponent process theory has been proposed to deal with some emotions, not necessarily all emotions, or all these sorts of things. It's been used to explain why joy or fear dampens over time, or isn't as great as it was. But that doesn't mean that it applies to everything, and it might have limited application. It's sort of a neat theory. We have some evidence for opponent processes. When we start to talk about drug abuse, we have very, very detailed data and very detailed information about opponent processes and how they work in drug abuse and substance abuse and addiction. And the model there is very, very appropriate. Maybe this emotion stuff, you can sort of buy it or not. It's up to you. It's also, opponent process is also used, as many of you have mentioned, as an explanation for some of the phenomena that we experience in visual perception. The visual system, there's some opponent process in that as well. And again, there's a lot of physiological evidence for that. In these emotional or elicited emotional states, it's been appealed to as an explanation, and you should know about it. You should know that that's the case. Whether you believe it or not, or whether you buy it or not, is maybe open for argument a little bit. Here's another example of fear in opponent process terms. Something scares you, fear comes on strongly, but as time goes by, relief takes over. And, the same event happens again, but relief comes a little more quickly. X happens again, it scares you a little bit, relief comes almost as soon as fear. Some people have said things like horror movies might be explained by opponent process theories. Why would we seek out events to be scared by? I mean, the scare is just as intense, but the relief gets better and better and better. Do we like to be scared, or do we like relief? It's an interesting question. I don't know how much time we're going to spend on how much time I want to spend on this, or I want you to spend thinking about this. I think there's a lot of things going on when we watch horror movies. But okay, so that's opponent process. Most of you guys didn't have questions on reaction chains, but I wanted to go over this very quickly because I want you to make sure that you understand the difference between a reaction chain and a fixed action pattern. These are two different things, and we can discriminate, or we can classify complex behavior along these two dimensions, or at least in these two categories. And you gotta get it right. Reaction chains are instinctual, they're complex. However, they can start at various points and they can end at various points. But there's a rigid execution of steps. So the classic reaction chain described in your book was the hermit shell, the hermit crab seeking out a shell. He can start that reaction chain at a particular point, and it can end at a particular point, but the steps along the way are very rigid. I asked you if this looks like problem solving to me, and some of you said, yeah, it looks like problem solving. The hermit crab doesn't have a shell, and he's got a problem, and he tries to solve it. And I think problem solving, while the hermit crab is a pretty cool organism, I wouldn't say that your problem solving is akin to the hermit crab finding a shell. I think that your repertoire of problem solving, your behavior of problem solving, likely involves some flexibility. Trying something else. And in particular, I think when you try something, you get feedback from that. Okay? It is a feedback system. But I think what's involved is operant conditioning, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we're going to see. We're going to see how this works. I think that problem solving is more of an operant behavior than it is a reflexive or a reaction chain. The hermit crab is bound to a particular pattern of behavior. Its attempts are the same each try. It does everything the same. So I want you to be careful about how we consider relations, behavioral relations, and what might look like something, what might look like love, or what might look like problem solving, or what might look like decision making, may not be that. Lloyd Morgan was a British guy, a British scientist or something, I forget. But he famously stated something he called, we now refer to as Morgan's canon. And that is, just because animals do it, it doesn't mean that it's the same as what humans do. So we can't give, what Morgan's canon says is, we can't give to animals the ability to do things that humans do just because things look like. That there might be completely different things at work, activities and processes at work. That doesn't mean that animals' behavior isn't, other non-human animal behavior isn't sophisticated, isn't dynamic, isn't really cool, and there's no way that we can know those things. For example, I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, rats, if you have a couple of not baby, but juvenile or adolescent rats, and they're playing with each other, they actually talk to one another. They actually make vocalizations. They actually make noises that we can't hear. And it's only recently that we've been able to construct sophisticated sound recording devices to measure these the talk of adolescent or juvenile rats. It turns out that they make noises in the range of 20,000 hertz to 50 or 60,000 hertz. We only hear to 10,000 hertz. We need sophisticated machinery to detect these sounds. And it turns out they have sort of a language that when they're playing, they make certain noises with each other, but if there's a predator around, they make different noises. You might look at a bird like a sparrow, and sparrows are these sort of common brown, gray birds that fly around and so on. And they all look the same. To us, we see them and we're like, yeah, there's a sparrow, and that looks like any other sparrow, and so on and so forth. But it turns out that they have colorings in their wings that is detectable in the spectrum outside of what we can see. But birds can see that. Other birds can see them. So they look completely different to one another because they can see colorings in their wings that we can't see. And by the way, a bird, in its behavioral output, a bird flies through a bush without touching a single leaf. There's no way we can do that. So there are things that animals do that we can't possibly do or possibly understand at this point, or we're just starting to understand. Morgan's canon is not about, boy, we're above the animals and they're really simple and we're really complicated. That's not what it's saying. What Morgan's canon is saying is is that we can't attribute to animals human abilities that look the same. We need to do the experiments. We need to find the evidence. Fixed action patterns, on the other hand, to contrast with reaction chains, are unique to a species. All the members of the species do it, and once started, it must go to completion. And there's a fairly rigid execution of steps, and it is not learned. It is instinct. Okay. Now, the difference between a fixed action pattern and a reaction chain is that it has to start at the same point and it ends at the same point. It always starts. It's elicited. It's started by what we call a sign stimulus or a releasing stimulus, and it has to go until the end. Its execution is rigidly performed, and it's only done when it's done. A reaction chain can end in multiple can end anywhere along the chain, but a fixed action pattern doesn't. It goes all the way to its completion, even at the expense of the animal. For example, there are some fish fixed action patterns that put them at risk that other species have figured out. They can elicit the fixed action pattern, and that puts them at risk for predation, for eating, for getting eaten. And likewise, a peacock has to do this little mating dance and mating display, and once it's started, it has to go all the way to the end. And it turns out that might take so long that the female's already mated with somebody else. So the fixed action patterns are we think were selected evolutionarily because they're really complex, and you don't want to teach them. It takes so long to teach them. So if they're genetically endowed, that's much better for the species. But it also can put the species at risk. Now, the other thing is that not all reflexes are fixed action patterns. Some of you noted, and I'll go through the wiki and point a few of these out, is that we distinguish simpler reflexes from fixed action patterns. What distinguishes a reflex from a fixed action pattern is really in its level of complexity. If it's a simple single response, like grasping a finger in an infant or sucking, those are not fixed action patterns. Like a baby's sucking is not a fixed action pattern because it's not necessarily unique to the species. All mammals have a sucking reflex as a baby. And the other thing is it's a fairly simple response, and it can habituate. Fixed action patterns don't tend to habituate, and they tend to be more complex. They tend to be a sequence of behavior that's released. I gave you some videos, some examples of fixed action patterns: squirrels burying nuts, the three-spined stickleback. The three-spined stickleback is classic because Tinbergen was the one that first studied these fish, these funny-looking fish, building a nest and the defense of the nest. The red underbelly was required for defense of the nest, as you saw if you watch the videos. There's also birds. Conrad Lorenz, I think, was the first to study the geese egg rolling fixed action patterns. Also peacocks courting. There's all sorts of bird displays that are fixed action patterns. So hopefully you guys got that. Now the main point about fixed action patterns, though, is how do we know that something is a fixed action pattern versus learned behavior? And the answer to the question is we do the experiments. And that is, and your book has a great example of describing how we found out squirrels were, the nut-bearing reflex was a fixed action pattern in squirrels. And that is, we raised squirrels in an environment from birth in which there was no dirt, there was no trees, there were no nuts. And the first time we gave that squirrel a nut, it tried to bury it. It tried to bury it in its stainless steel cage. So I love this quote from B.F. Skinner: "Regard no practice as immutable, change and be ready to change again. Accept no eternal verity, experiment." That means, what he's saying is, don't accept anything as being true. You gotta do the experiment. You gotta continue to experiment, continue to explore, continue to question. Okay, so that's what I had on the video or the lecture end. What I wanted to do now was go and look at the wiki, and I have to say that you guys this is awesome. the answers have 99% of them have been absolutely great. I hope this is working for you guys. I know it might be a little confusing, but keep jamming away. This is great. These answers are actually absolutely wonderful. I've been writing, for example, you can see right here, I wrote a little comment and I put it in green for the sign stimulus. And the sign stimulus is basically the stimulus that starts the fixed action pattern. It instigates the fixed action pattern, which is a perfect definition. Um, what I would be careful about is simple reflexes. We don't call those stimuli sign stimuli. We call them unconditional stimuli. Fixed action patterns are fairly complex. Simple reflexes we're gonna call reflexes. We're not going to call them fixed action patterns, because if you think about the word fixed action pattern, it's a pattern of behavior. It's not just one behavior. Reflexes tend to be just one action. So be careful when you're talking about that. Sign stimuli, go with fixed action patterns. But what we call the stimuli that elicit a reflex, we call those unconditional stimuli. So a lot of good answers here. Of course, nobody answered who John Watson was. Hopefully, maybe we can figure out some stuff. This this example and generalization I really liked. It's pretty good stuff. But what we're going to learn, I think, is that the command of sit is going to be an operant discriminative stimulus. It's not going to be a conditional stimulus, because it's not going to elicit a reflex or a conditional response. What it's going to do is occasion a behavior to be reinforced. So again, we're going to classify stimuli as conditional stimuli, unconditional stimuli, but then we're also going to talk later on in the semester about discriminative stimuli. Discriminative stimuli are associated with operant behavior, that is, behavior that's reinforced. As you'll notice in the reflexes, there's no reinforcement involved. There's no punishment involved. There's no consequence of the action. And that's one of the important parts that we're going to be talking about. So we might want to be careful about this, but it is true that we're going to see generalization with discriminative stimuli as well. Generalization I usually define as behaving similarly in a different situation. That is, the animal might hear a word and sit, and that's not a bad example of operant generalization. I like this comment about the hermit crab. I completely agree that I think problem solving involves some flexibility, and the hermit crab's behavior is not flexible. It's flexible in terms of when it starts and when it ends, but what's in between is completely genetically determined, and that's not problem solving in humans as far as I'm concerned. I might take I might say that I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't think I would actually have to say I don't agree with this at all. The grasp a newborn exhibits is what we would call a reflex. It's not a fixed action pattern. Fixed action patterns, again, we tend to think of as being complex patterns of behavior or a sequence of behavior, not just a sort of single simple action like grasping. So I would call those reflexes rather than fixed action patterns. And I think that was it. Hopefully those sorts of things answered your questions. I got a lot of, you guys gave me a lot of good feedback about seeing the sea slug, the Aplysia californica, and hopefully that works for all you guys. So if you have any questions, drop me an email. If not, good luck, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.